A palace coup is the monarchy's dirtiest secret. Behind the gold leaf and grand traditions, royal residences have always been hotbeds of silent power grabs and brutal family betrayals. For centuries, these hidden wars were the true engine of royal history, yet every single one was officially denied. We are going behind the gilded doors to uncover the shocking truth of these internal takeovers. You will learn the real stories of kings and queens forcibly sidelined, of heirs molded by shadowy advisors, and of modern princes exiled from their own families. How did a king's own government quietly force him from the throne? What really happened when a queen was put on trial by her husband? By the end, you will understand the ruthless, unspoken rules that have governed royalty for generations. These are not simple scandals. They are calculated, internal strikes for survival. What does it truly take to tear down a monarch from the inside? Behind the towering gates and manicured gardens, royal life was a beautiful prison. The palaces of 19th and early 20th century Europe were monuments to unimaginable wealth, filled with gold leaf, priceless art, and armies of silent servants. Yet this opulence served as a cage, its bars forged from rigid etiquette and suffocating duty. Every minute of every day was governed by an unspoken code of conduct. Who entered a room first, who sat where at dinner, the precise angle of a bow or curtsy. These were not minor details. They were the entire language of power. In this world, a misplaced word or a slight breach of protocol could shatter a reputation built over generations. The pressure to maintain a flawless public image was immense, a constant, heavy weight on every royal shoulder. This created a pressure cooker environment, a hothouse where normal family rivalries festered into something far more dangerous. Siblings were not merely competing for a parent's affection, they were rivals for a throne. Aunts and uncles were not just family, they were potential regents or political opponents. In such an atmosphere, ambition curdled into conspiracy, and jealousy festered into silent, carefully planned treachery. The palace, for all its glittering splendor, was the perfect breeding ground for a coup. So what exactly was a palace coup? It was not a violent revolution with crowds storming the gates. It was not a military rebellion with soldiers marching in the streets. Instead, it was a silent, internal seizure of power. Picture a grand chess game played within the palace walls, where the most powerful pieces were family members, trusted courtiers, and senior government officials. Their target was the king or queen themselves, a monarch deemed unfit to rule. The reasons varied wildly. A ruler might be seen as too extravagant, draining the national treasury for personal pleasures. They could be politically dangerous, pursuing alliances or policies that threatened the stability of the entire nation. Or perhaps they were simply mentally unstable, their judgment too unpredictable to trust with the crown. The goal of a palace coup was not necessarily to kill the monarch, but to sideline them, to gently, or sometimes forcefully, remove the levers of power from their grasp. This could mean forcing a king to sign abdication papers under immense pressure. It might involve declaring a prince mentally incompetent and installing a regent to rule in his name. Often, it was a quiet campaign of isolation where trusted advisors were replaced, official documents were withheld, and the ruler was slowly cut off from any real authority. becoming a prisoner in a gilded cage. The public would see the palace facade, perfectly intact, but behind the scenes, a new power was already in control. Denial was the most powerful weapon in the royal arsenal. For a monarchy to admit that a king had been forcibly removed by his own family or government was to saw off the very branch it sat upon. The entire system relied on the myth of divine right, the unshakable belief that God himself had chosen this specific family to rule. How could that be true if the family was tearing itself apart in secret wars for power? Public knowledge of a palace coup would shatter the illusion of perfect harmony, revealing the crown not as a sacred trust, but as a prize to be stolen. It would invite every ambitious noble and every political rival to try their own hand at the game. So the truth had to be buried, always. The official story was everything. This required a public relations machine of immense sophistication, long before the term was even invented. Royal courts perfected the art of controlling the narrative. They cultivated a loyal press that would only print approved stories, transforming messy, brutal realities into tidy, palatable fairy tales. A king forced from the throne due to madness or incompetence would be announced as having abdicated voluntarily for the good of the nation, perhaps due to fragile health. A queen put on trial by her husband would be publicly portrayed as being cared for in a quiet retreat. Every public appearance was a carefully orchestrated performance. When a royal family was secretly at war, they were still paraded together in open carriages, smiling and waving to adoring crowds. They attended church services side by side, presenting a united front of pious devotion. The clothes they wore, the gifts they exchanged, every gesture was a piece of propaganda designed to scream one thing: all is well. The palace walls did more than keep people out. They kept the truth in, allowing a fiction of perfect unity to flourish no matter what turmoil raged within. How many public smiles, do you think, have hidden the most profound private betrayals? The marriage of King George IV and Caroline of Brunswick was a battlefield from the very first day. Here was a union so toxic, it weaponized the entire British establishment, transforming a private feud into a public spectacle and a brutal, prolonged coup against a queen. George loathed his wife, and he was determined not merely to be rid of her, but to utterly annihilate her position and reputation. His methods were a masterclass in using the system against itself, a quiet, relentless campaign to strip a queen of her title, her dignity, and her very right to exist within the monarchy. This was not a single dramatic event, but a war of attrition fought with lawyers, spies, and vicious propaganda. The king's goal was a divorce, an act that would legally and socially erase Caroline, ensuring she could never be crowned beside him. He assembled a secret commission, known as the Delicate Investigation, to dredge up any hint of scandal in her behavior. He barred her from their daughter's funeral, a cruelty designed to break her spirit. And when he finally ascended the throne, his most public act of exclusion was his coronation. George explicitly forbade Caroline from attending the ceremony, placing guards at the doors of Westminster Abbey to physically prevent her from taking her place as queen. Can you envision the scene? The new king crowned in sublime splendor while his lawful queen was literally shut out, pounding on the doors. The entire power structure, from parliament to the press, was largely complicit in this denial of her rights. They supported the king's narrative that Caroline was an unfit, immoral woman, unworthy of the crown. Yet in this ruthless personal crusade, George exposed the dark mechanics of a palace coup. He demonstrated that the tools of state, the law, and public opinion could all be marshaled to remove a person from power, not by force of arms, but by 1,000 legal and social cuts. The denial was absolute. The king's version of events was the only one that mattered, and the establishment stood firmly behind him, proving that the most effective coup is one that dresses itself in the robes of legal procedure and righteous scandal. The delicate investigation was a weapon disguised as an inquiry. King George IV, then still the Prince Regent, initiated this secret commission in 1806, not to find truth, but to manufacture a weapon. His goal was to gather enough salacious evidence of adultery against Caroline to secure a divorce. The investigation pried into every aspect of her life, interrogating servants and former staff, searching for any whisper of impropriety. They focused on her adoption of a young boy, William Austen, spreading vile rumors that he was her illegitimate son. But the plan backfired spectacularly. The investigation failed to produce the damning proof the prince so desperately wanted. Its final report was ambiguous, a political fudge that criticized Caroline's behavior as indiscreet, but found no concrete evidence of the adultery needed for divorce. Instead of destroying her, the delicate investigation made Caroline a martyr. The public saw a foreign princess, admittedly eccentric and emotionally unrestrained, being hounded by a corrupt and profligate prince. Pamphlets and newspapers sympathetic to her cause detailed the investigation's tactics, framing it as a gross injustice. Caroline was transformed from a figure of ridicule into a populist heroine, a symbol of the common person abused by a decadent aristocracy. This was the moment the battle truly left the palace walls. The conflict was no longer contained within the gilded corridors of power. It spilled out into the muddy streets of London. Ordinary people who had their own grievances against the prince and the ruling class took up Caroline's cause with a fervor that shocked the establishment. They bought the pamphlets that portrayed her as a wronged wife. They signed petitions demanding she be given her rightful place. They cheered for her in the streets and hissed at the king's supporters. The official narrative, carefully crafted by the crown, was being challenged and dismantled by a powerful new force, public opinion. For the first time, the monarchy's dirty laundry was not just being aired, it was being judged by the entire nation. The denial was no longer absolute. The palace could no longer control the story because the people were now writing their own. The machinery of state now turned against a king himself. Nearly a century after the public war over Queen Caroline, a new constitutional crisis unfolded. But this time, the establishment had learned its lesson. The removal of King Edward VIII in 1936 remains the modern world's most perfectly executed palace coup, a masterful act of political theater disguised as a romantic sacrifice. The official story is one we all know, a king who gave up his throne for the woman he loved. The reality was a forced abdication, a quiet, relentless campaign by the government, the church, and his own family to push an uncooperative monarch off the throne. Edward was a problem. His desire to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, was seen as an existential threat to the monarchy's moral authority. The Church of England, of which he was the supreme governor, forbade the remarriage of divorced persons if their former spouses were still alive. The government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, saw the relationship as a constitutional nightmare and a public relations disaster. They presented the king with an impossible choice: abandon Wallis Simpson or lose the crown. But this was never a real choice. It was an ultimatum. The full weight of the British establishment descended upon him. He was isolated. His official documents were withheld, and his family, particularly his mother, Queen Mary, and his brother, Bertie, stood firmly with the government. There would be no compromise, no morganatic marriage where Wallis would be his wife, but not his queen. The pressure was immense and unyielding. His abdication speech, broadcast to the world, was a masterpiece of misdirection. He spoke of finding it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved. He framed it as his own voluntary decision. The public, captivated by the romance of it all, largely believed the performance. They never saw the intense political coercion happening behind the scenes, the cold calculation that deemed one man's personal happiness an acceptable price to pay for the stability of the crown. The denial was seamless, the narrative perfectly controlled. A king was deposed by his own people, and the world was told he had simply walked away for love. The monarchy survived, its image intact, because the messy truth of its internal power struggle was buried beneath a fairy tale. What does it say about an institution that must disguise its own survival mechanisms as acts of the heart? Stanley Baldwin was the quiet architect of the king's removal. As prime minister, he did not command armies, but he wielded something far more powerful in this delicate situation: the full authority of the British government and its unwritten constitution. His strategy was not one of public confrontation, but of private, relentless pressure. He held a series of secret meetings with Edward VIII, each one a carefully calibrated step in a campaign to force an abdication. Baldwin presented the king with a stark, and in his view, an impossible choice. He could not marry Wallis Simpson and remain on the throne. The government would resign if he pursued the marriage, triggering a general election that would have dragged the monarchy into the center of a brutal political fight. The very institution of the crown would be seen as causing a national crisis. This was the ultimate threat, a constitutional nuclear option. Baldwin made it clear that no compromise, such as a morganatic marriage, was acceptable to his cabinet or to the parliaments across the Commonwealth. He systematically boxed the king in, presenting these not as his own personal opinions, but as the unchangeable will of the entire political establishment. It was a political checkmate disguised as sage advice. Yet Baldwin's true genius lay in his manipulation of the narrative. He understood that the reality of a government forcing out a king was far too dangerous a truth for the public to ever know. So he and his allies masterfully managed the press, ensuring that British newspapers remained almost completely silent on the scandal for months, while subtly guiding the narrative toward the only acceptable conclusion. When the story finally broke, it was framed entirely as the king's own romantic and noble sacrifice. Baldwin presented himself as a sorrowful counselor, merely accepting his sovereign's heartbreaking decision. He executed a soft coup with such precision that it was universally seen as a voluntary abdication. The prime minister denied any forceful action so completely that his role as the king's primary political executioner was all but erased from the public memory. The state had removed its own head and convinced the world the head had chosen to roll away on its own. How many other acts of supreme political power have been successfully disguised as personal choice? Wallis Simpson was the perfect villain for a monarchy in crisis. She was not merely an American. She was a divorcee, not once but twice, with both of her former husbands still living. To the British establishment, this made her radioactive. She represented everything the monarchy was supposed to stand against: modernity, moral laxity, and foreign influence. The fear she inspired went far beyond personal dislike for her brash manner or her expensive tastes. The men in power, from Prime Minister Baldwin to the Archbishop of Canterbury, saw her as a direct threat to the spiritual and constitutional foundation of the crown itself. The king was the supreme governor of the Church of England, an institution that at the time held firm to its teachings on marriage. For him to marry a woman with 2 living ex-husbands was not a personal scandal. It was an institutional catastrophe. It would shatter the carefully cultivated image of the royal family as the moral exemplar for the nation and the empire. But the prejudice ran deeper than theology. She was an outsider who understood nothing of the unwritten rules and quiet sacrifices required of royalty. They watched in horror as the king seemed to prioritize his relationship with her over his duty to the crown. In their eyes, she was not just a romantic partner. She was a foreign agent of chaos, an unwitting catalyst for a constitutional meltdown. Her very existence forced the hand of the entire British government, compelling them to execute the most delicate and decisive palace coup of the modern era. The king's love for her was the spark, but the tinder was the establishment's profound fear of what she represented: a future where the monarchy's authority could be irreparably weakened by the whims of the heart. How could an institution built on centuries of tradition possibly survive a queen who had already rejected the sanctity of marriage not once, but twice? The king's power was being stripped away layer by layer, a silent dismantling behind the throne. While Edward VIII remained the public face of the monarchy, a coordinated effort was underway to ensure he had no political ground left to stand on. His allies within the government and the royal court were systematically identified and sidelined. Winston Churchill, one of the few powerful figures who initially supported the king's right to marry, found himself isolated and shouted down in Parliament. The message was clear: backing Edward was a political dead end. Simultaneously, the king's access to the machinery of state was quietly severed. The infamous red boxes, the dispatch cases containing sensitive government documents, began to arrive less frequently. When they did, crucial papers were often missing. He was being cut off from the very information he needed to rule, transformed from an active sovereign into a ceremonial figurehead. This was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, administrative strangulation. Every official he trusted was replaced. Every channel of influence was blocked. The establishment presented a united, impenetrable front, leaving the king with no one to turn to and no viable political path forward. Publicly, the illusion of his full authority was meticulously maintained. He still performed his duties, shook hands, and smiled for the cameras. But behind the palace walls, he was a monarch in name only, a king presiding over an empty court. His departure was no longer a choice between love and duty, but the only option remaining after his support had been utterly erased. How terrifying must it be to sit on the throne and realize, too late, that you are the only one who still believes you are king? Lord Louis Mountbatten moved through the royal world with the polished confidence of a man born to power. A war hero, the last Viceroy of India, and a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, he possessed a stature that few could rival. But his true ambition lay not in his own titles, but in shaping the future of the monarchy itself. He saw in his great-nephew, the young Prince Charles, a blank canvas, a future king who could be molded into a modern monarch according to a very specific blueprint, his own. This relationship, often portrayed as a benevolent mentorship, is now viewed by many historians as a sophisticated, long-term soft coup, a quiet seizure of a prince's mind and loyalties. Mountbatten became the prince's most trusted confidant, a substitute father figure whose influence far outstripped that of the boy's own parents. He filled Charles's head with stories of imperial grandeur and instilled in him a sense of destiny. But it was a destiny that Mountbatten himself had carefully designed. The older man's letters and advice were constant, guiding the prince's education, his naval career, and most profoundly, his views on marriage. It was Mountbatten who famously advised Charles that a royal prince should sow his wild oats with as many women as possible before settling down with a well-bred, virginal aristocrat to secure the lineage. This was not casual advice. It was a calculated strategy for crafting a specific kind of king, one whose personal life would be managed with cold, political precision. The palace and the government consistently downplayed Mountbatten's role, framing it as a simple, affectionate bond between an old man and a young prince. But behind the scenes, he was the ultimate gray eminence, a master of palace politics who understood that the most effective way to control a throne is to shape the mind of the person who will one day sit on it. His influence was a silent, pervasive force, always present in the prince's life, yet always officially denied as anything more than family devotion. What does it mean for a future king to have his entire world shaped by a man with his own imperial ambitions? Mountbatten's ultimate goal was a merger of bloodlines, a plan so audacious it would secure his own family's influence for generations. He envisioned his granddaughter, Amanda Knatchbull, as the future queen. For years, he gently but persistently steered Charles toward this conclusion, embedding the idea during long conversations and in his prolific correspondence. This was not merely a grandfather's hopeful matchmaking. It was a calculated political strategy. By placing his own descendant beside the throne, Mountbatten would effectively become the architect of a new royal dynasty, his personal legacy forever intertwined with the crown itself. Every piece of advice, every bit of grooming, was a step toward this singular objective. He meticulously shaped the prince's entire upbringing to fit this grand design. Mountbatten pushed Charles toward a naval career, not just for tradition, but to instill a specific brand of disciplined imperial leadership he himself embodied. He heavily influenced the prince's education, steering him away from certain intellectual pursuits he deemed too soft and toward a curriculum that built a resilient, worldly monarch. His vision for modernizing the monarchy was not about democratization, but about creating a more efficient, media-savvy institution that retained its power by appearing more accessible. He wanted a king who could command respect on the global stage while remaining utterly predictable and controllable behind palace walls. This relentless, multi-decade campaign was a quiet takeover of an heir's very soul. Charles was not simply being mentored, he was being programmed. His thoughts on duty, his understanding of power, even his future romantic life were being systematically shaped to fulfill another man's ambition. The palace, of course, publicly celebrated Mountbatten as a devoted great uncle offering harmless guidance. To acknowledge the truth that a senior royal was conducting a long-term, unsanctioned experiment in king-making would have revealed the monarchy as a vessel for private agendas rather than a sacred institution. So the narrative of the kindly mentor persisted, a necessary fiction that concealed one of the most profound and personal palace coups ever attempted. How do you prepare a king for his destiny when that destiny is not truly his own? Princess Margaret presented a problem of a different kind. She was not a king to be dethroned, but a vibrant, rebellious spirit who threatened the monarchy's newly polished image with the sheer force of her personality. Her life became a case study in a softer, more insidious form of palace coup, one designed not to remove a ruler, but to neutralize a liability. The establishment did not confront her with legal ultimatums or political pressure. Instead, they built a beautiful, comfortable cage around her, systematically stripping away her purpose and her passions under the guise of royal protocol and family concern. Her romance with Group Captain Peter Townsend was the catalyst. He was a war hero, a handsome and respectable man, but he was also a divorcee. For the sister of the Queen, this was an insurmountable obstacle in the eyes of the government and the church. She was not forced to choose between love and duty through a dramatic confrontation. The pressure was applied with quiet, crushing finality. The Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury made it clear that a marriage to Townsend was constitutionally unacceptable. If she proceeded, she would be stripped of her royal title, her income, and her position in the line of succession. She would be cast out, rendered a commoner. It was an offer she could not possibly accept, a choice designed to look like her own decision, but which was in reality a directive from the highest levels of power. The message was unmistakable. Your personal happiness is a price the crown is unwilling to pay. Her public role was slowly and deliberately diminished. Official engagements were reduced. She was given fewer responsibilities, less exposure. The palace machine, so adept at crafting narratives, began to reframe her not as a working royal, but as a decorative one, a glamorous accessory to the real business of monarchy. She was pushed to the periphery, her sharp wit and modern tastes increasingly seen as a risk rather than an asset. Can you imagine the frustration to possess the energy and desire for a meaningful role, only to find every path gently but firmly blocked? Her freedoms were curtailed under the watchful eye of courtiers who reported back to the palace. Her social circle was scrutinized, her travels monitored. She was encouraged towards a life of luxury and leisure, a directionless existence filled with parties and exotic holidays that only served to further alienate her from the stoic, dutiful image her sister embodied. This was the denial in its most genteel form. There were no guards at the door, no withheld documents. There was only the slow, steady erosion of a life, a quiet removal from influence so complete that it was almost invisible. The public was told that Princess Margaret was a complex, sometimes difficult woman, a narrative that conveniently obscured the fact that the system had methodically broken her spirit. The palace had protected itself from scandal, not by a dramatic battle, but by 1,000 polite and painful cuts. What does it cost a family to preserve its image when the price is the happiness of one of its own? The weapon deployed against Margaret and Townsend was not a secret conspiracy, but the law itself. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 was a constitutional trapdoor, long forgotten by the public, but kept perfectly oiled by the palace. This ancient statute gave the sovereign absolute veto power over the marriages of any descendant of King George II. For Princess Margaret, this meant she could not legally marry Peter Townsend without her sister, the Queen's formal consent, given under the Privy Council. It was a legal straitjacket, and everyone in power knew it. The Queen was not a free agent in this matter. She was surrounded by the Prime Minister, the Archbishop, and senior courtiers, all advising the same thing. Consent could not and would not be granted. The law was not a shield to protect her, but a cage designed to contain her. It transformed a personal desire into a state affair, a constitutional crisis in miniature. The government and the church stood as a unified wall of opposition. The Church of England, still reeling from the abdication crisis 2 decades prior, could not countenance the Queen's sister marrying a divorced man. The Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, made it brutally clear that if Margaret married against the Queen's advice, the government would fall, and she would be stripped of her royal privileges and her income. They presented this not as a punishment, but as an inevitable, neutral consequence of the law. It was a masterful use of constitutional weaponry, framing a personal denial as an institutional necessity. Can you feel the weight of that machinery? A young woman's future was decided not by her heart, but by an act of parliament from the 18th century, wielded by men in dark suits who saw her love as a threat to national stability. This was the most polite form of a coup, executed with legal documents and precedents instead of force. Her personal autonomy was sacrificed on the altar of the institution, and the law provided the perfect, unassailable excuse. The relationship between the palace and the press became a weaponized alliance, a silent partnership for managing troublesome royals. In the 20th century, a new, unspoken deal was struck. Fleet Street editors received unparalleled access to the fairy tale, the weddings, the births, the glittering state occasions. In return, they agreed to a system of favors and denials, a carefully managed exchange where certain stories were amplified while others were buried. This created a powerful, off-the-books mechanism for the palace to shape public perception and quietly eliminate internal threats. When a royal was deemed a liability, the machine could be set in motion. A carefully placed leak to a trusted reporter could unleash a torrent of negative press, framing a prince as lazy, a princess as extravagant, or a duchess as difficult. These were not random scandals, but strategic narratives designed to erode public sympathy and justify the royals' eventual marginalization. The target, bombarded by a seemingly organic wave of public disapproval, would find their position within the family increasingly untenable. Their own family could then point to the headlines as proof that they were a problem that needed to be managed. Conversely, the power to suppress a story was equally potent. An embarrassing affair, a financial indiscretion, a mental health crisis, all could be made to disappear with a single, discreet phone call from a senior courtier. This was the ultimate carrot and stick. For royals who played by the unwritten rules, the press could be a shield. For those who stepped out of line, it became a sword, wielded by their own household. This symbiotic dance was the modern equivalent of a palace coup, no longer requiring lawyers or abdications, but executed through the morning headlines. The public consuming the daily news rarely realized they were witnessing a choreographed campaign, a trial not held in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion, a court whose judges were often secretly guided by the very institution they were reporting on. The modern palace coup is a masterpiece of public relations, a swift and bloodless removal executed in plain sight. Prince Andrew's fall from grace stands as the most recent textbook example of this ancient practice, updated for the 24-hour news cycle. His association with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein became a contagion the monarchy could not afford to catch. The institution did not hesitate. In a matter of days, a coordinated sequence of events unfolded with brutal efficiency. A family summit was held at the Queen's private estate, a council of war disguised as a meeting. The result was a carefully worded public statement issued from the prince himself, announcing that he was stepping back from royal duties for the foreseeable future. The language was deliberate, framing the most profound professional exile as a voluntary, almost thoughtful, personal choice. But the actions that followed revealed the truth. His royal patronages, the charitable organizations he represented, were stripped away and returned to the Queen. His cherished military titles, including Colonel of the Grenadier Guards, were taken back. He was removed from the royal family's official website and barred from using his HRH style in any official capacity. He was scrubbed from the public face of the monarchy, his presence erased as if he were a digital ghost. The entire operation was a clinical strike, designed to cauterize a wound before it could poison the entire body of the crown. The public was told the prince had chosen to step down. The reality was that the institution had pushed him off the stage, ensuring his toxic shadow would no longer fall upon the Queen's Platinum Jubilee or the future reign of his brother, Charles. It was a denial so seamless it was almost artistic, a forced expulsion packaged as a personal decision for the good of the family. How many other difficult choices, do you suppose, are made behind closed doors and then handed to a royal to announce as their own? The monarchy operates with a single, ruthless corporate directive: survive at all costs. Insiders have long referred to the royal machine as the firm, a nickname that perfectly captures its true nature. This is not merely a family. It is a multi-billion-dollar global enterprise, a brand whose primary product is its own mystique. Every palace coup we have witnessed, from the hounding of Queen Caroline to the exile of Prince Andrew, was not a random act of family drama. It was a calculated, systemic action by the firm to eliminate a perceived threat. The institution functions like a living organism with a powerful immune system, one that identifies and aggressively purges any weakness that could compromise the whole body. A king whose politics are dangerous, a queen whose morals are questioned, a prince whose associations are toxic, all are treated the same way as a pathogen. The survival of the monarchy as an institution will always, without exception, be prioritized over the happiness, freedom, or even the reign of any single individual within it. This is the cold, unspoken logic that has governed royalty for centuries. Why do you think the official stories are always so clean, so sentimental? The narrative of a king abdicating for love, a princess sacrificing for duty, a prince stepping back for the family, these are not truths. They are the necessary veil of denial, the carefully crafted fiction that maintains the central myth of a united, divinely ordained family. The firm cannot admit it operates like a corporation conducting hostile takeovers against its own figureheads. To do so would be to reveal the crown not as a sacred trust, but as a brutal business where the bottom line is its own perpetual existence. The gilded facade must remain perfectly intact, even as the machinery behind it grinds up lives and dreams to fuel its own continuity. The true architects of these silent takeovers were never the kings or queens themselves, but the men in the shadows, the private secretaries and senior courtiers. These were the civil servants of the crown, unelected officials, whose names were unknown to the public, but whose influence was absolute within the palace walls. They mastered the intricate machinery of monarchy, and the most powerful among them could make or break a reign. Sir Alan Lascelles, known as Tommy, was the epitome of this power. As private secretary to both King George VI and the early Queen Elizabeth II, he was the gatekeeper, the strategist, and the enforcer. His word could determine which minister met the sovereign, which letter reached her desk, and which piece of news was quietly buried. He operated with an iron fist, cloaked in the impeccable manners of a seasoned diplomat. Lascelles did not merely advise, he managed. He saw it as his sacred duty to protect the institution from the whims of any individual, even if that individual wore the crown. His most famous intervention was with the former King Edward VIII, who, after his abdication, occasionally proposed returning to England for minor public roles. Lascelles famously shut down these notions with a single, brutal phrase, telling a colleague that the idea was impossible, stating, "One cannot have two kings in the same bottle." He understood that a former monarch, especially a popular one, was a political virus that could not be allowed to circulate. His power was so complete that he could effectively veto the desires of a royal duke, not through a public fight, but through a quiet, unassailable memo. Can you envision the scene? A man who was never elected, never crowned, deciding the fate of princes from a mahogany desk. These courtiers held more real, day-to-day authority than many royals. They controlled the flow of information, the schedule of engagements, the very narrative of the family. When a monarch was deemed a problem, it was often the private secretary who orchestrated the soft pressure, the strategic leaks, the careful isolation that made a departure seem inevitable. They were the engineers of stability, the quiet mechanics who ensured the train of state stayed on its tracks, even if it meant quietly uncoupling a rogue carriage. Their ultimate loyalty was not to the person on the throne, but to the throne itself, an abstraction that justified almost any action taken in its defense. The marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales became a civil war broadcast to the world. This was not a quiet, internal power struggle confined to palace corridors. It was a brutal, public battle where the front lines were drawn in the tabloid newspapers. Charles and Diana each commanded rival camps of loyalists, aides, and friendly journalists, turning their private disintegration into a weaponized media campaign. The establishment, from senior courtiers to the Queen's private secretary, largely formed a protective ring around the heir to the throne. Their initial strategy was a quiet, relentless campaign to discredit Diana, to paint her as unstable, manipulative, and unfit for her role, thereby neutralizing her immense public appeal and protecting the future of the monarchy embodied in Charles. The war was fought with leaked stories, a devastating tit-for-tat, where an anonymous quote from Charles' camp questioning Diana's state of mind would be met with a strategically placed detail from her friends about his cold indifference. This created a frantic, chaotic atmosphere where the truth was the first casualty, and public perception was the only territory that mattered. Can you conceive of the pressure, living every day under that microscope, knowing your every word could be twisted into ammunition for the next day's headlines? The goal was to force a narrative, to make one spouse appear so irredeemably flawed that their removal from the center of royal life would seem not just justified, but necessary. Then the tapes were released, and the private war became a national obsession. First came Squidgygate, a recording of an intimate, and at times embarrassingly affectionate, telephone conversation between Diana and a male friend. The media seized on it, using the content to portray her as emotionally needy and disloyal. But this was merely the opening salvo. The true earthquake was Camillagate, a recorded call between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles. Its contents were devastating for the prince's public image. Here was the future king, the man destined to be the supreme governor of the Church of England, engaged in an explicitly intimate conversation with a married woman, even joking about wishing to be reincarnated as her tampon. The vulgarity and raw intimacy of the call shattered the carefully constructed facade of his marriage and his personal dignity. The palace was thrown into a panic. The establishment's initial strategy of quietly undermining Diana had catastrophically backfired. Charles was now exposed, his judgment and morality laid bare in the most humiliating way possible. The two tapes, played against each other in the press, created a bizarre and deeply damaging public spectacle. It was no longer a matter of one side winning the media war. It was a mutually assured destruction that threatened to bring down the entire House of Windsor. How could the monarchy possibly maintain its aura of moral authority when the private lives of its two most famous representatives were being dissected in such sordid detail? The initial unified front of the palace crumbled into open factionalism. On one side stood the prince's camp, a circle of old guard courtiers and aristocratic friends who saw Diana as a hysterical and unpredictable force who refused to play her assigned role. They whispered to reporters about her alleged eating disorders and her volatile temperament, framing her as a woman too fragile for the immense duty she carried. Their objective was clear: to steady the ship by rallying behind the heir and isolating the troublesome princess. Diana, however, proved to be a master of a new kind of warfare. She bypassed the traditional channels entirely, forging direct and powerful alliances with key journalists and editors. She understood the power of imagery in a way the palace dinosaurs did not. Her famous solo visit to sit alone in front of the Taj Mahal, a monument to love, was a visual statement more powerful than any press release. It screamed of a marriage in ruins, of a lonely princess abandoned by her husband. She used her global celebrity as a shield and a sword, knowing that her connection with the public was her greatest source of power. The palace could try to manage the newspapers, but they could not manage the world's affection for her. This created an impossible situation for the establishment. Their traditional tools for managing a crisis were useless against a royal who refused to be managed, who spoke the modern language of media emotion far more fluently than they did. The War of the Wallises was ultimately a battle between the old world of discreet denials and the new world of public sentiment. And for a long, painful period, it seemed the old world was losing. Diana turned the cameras into her own personal arsenal. In November 1995, she walked alone into a studio for a BBC Panorama interview and detonated a bomb at the very foundation of the monarchy. Seated calmly, she dismantled the palace's narrative piece by piece. She spoke of a marriage of three people, a devastatingly clear reference to Camilla Parker Bowles. She questioned whether her husband was fit to be king, and with a quiet, rehearsed precision, she cast doubt on the entire institution he represented. But her most brilliant and ruthless move was to reframe her own alleged instability as a consequence of the system's cruelty. She spoke openly of her bulimia and her deep unhappiness, not as personal failings, but as symptoms of a cold, unfeeling institution that had chewed her up and spat her out. This was not a plea for sympathy. It was a calculated countercoup. She was wresting control of her story from the palace machine and handing it directly to the public. The establishment was left reeling. They had spent years trying to paint her as the problem, and in 1 hour, she had convincingly argued that the monarchy itself was the sickness. Her revenge was total. She had exposed the brutal human cost of their survival mechanisms, and the world was listening. The Queen, seeing no other way to staunch the bleeding, soon after wrote to both Charles and Diana, insisting they divorce. Diana had forced the institution's hand, achieving through public rebellion what she never could through private negotiation. But this victory came at a terrible, unforeseen price. Her war for narrative control had made her an exile, both from the royal family and from the protection it could offer. Her tragic death less than 2 years later was the seismic shock that the palace coup against her could never have predicted. The outpouring of public grief was not just for a princess. It was a raw, angry indictment of the family she had left behind. The monarchy, holed up in Balmoral, appeared remote and heartless, utterly disconnected from the people they were meant to serve. The sea of flowers at the palace gates, the furious headlines demanding the Queen's show emotion, the unprecedented public pressure that forced her to address the nation, all of it proved one terrifying new rule. A successful internal coup could neutralize a royal, but it could not control the external fallout. The palace had won the war against Diana, but in doing so, they had nearly lost the kingdom. Her death forced a profound and permanent change, a reluctant modernization born not from wisdom, but from sheer survival instinct. The monarchy had to learn to show a human face, because the world had now seen the cold, gilded mask and had recoiled from it. What is the true cost of winning a war inside the palace, if it means losing the faith of the people outside its walls? Prince Harry and Meghan Markle turned the ancient playbook inside out. They launched a coup not for the throne, but for their freedom, and in doing so, forced the monarchy into its most modern and public negotiation. The couple's announcement that they would step back as senior royals was a seismic shock, a decision made without the Queen's prior approval. This was not a quiet internal maneuver. It was a global public declaration of independence. The palace, caught entirely off guard, was suddenly facing a crisis of control. The institution's survival instinct kicked in immediately, not to punish, but to contain. The result was the Sandringham Summit, an emergency meeting at the Queen's private estate that felt more like a corporate merger negotiation than a family discussion. Around that table, the future of a royal duke and his family was being decided not by birthright, but by branding rights and financial liabilities. The palace's primary objective was to regain control of the narrative and prevent the couple from becoming a rival, commercialized royal court in North America. The solution was a brutal, bureaucratic dismantling of their official lives. Their royal patronages, the military appointments Harry held so dear, and their use of the HRH styles were all formally returned to the crown. They were stripped of the very tools that defined their royal function, effectively neutering their ability to represent the institution while still trading on its name. This was the firm's calculated response, a controlled demolition designed to protect the brand above all else. The public was told this was a supportive transition, a new model for a modern royal family. The reality was a structured demotion, a managed exit that denied them the symbolic power of their titles, while ensuring they remained financially independent of the strained British taxpayer. How do you fight a rebellion when the rebels are not trying to seize your power, but to flee from it? The palace's genius was in framing this forced restructuring as a mutual agreement, a necessary evolution. It was a denial of the conflict so complete that it transformed a humiliating internal rift into a story of dignified compromise. The institution had been challenged, but it proved it could still dictate the terms of surrender. The opera interview was their nuclear option. Harry and Meghan sat in that lush California garden and launched a direct, televised assault on the very heart of the institution. They did not just air personal grievances. They framed their experience as a systematic, institutional coup designed to push them out. Their accusations were a litany of modern royal warfare, a checklist of how the firm neutralizes a threat. They spoke of a profound and chilling lack of support, of being cut off financially and stripped of security, leaving them feeling abandoned and exposed. They described a cold, bureaucratic process of being stripped of their official duties, their royal credit cards frozen, their ability to earn a living systematically severed. This was not a simple family disagreement. It was a calculated financial and operational stranglehold. But the most explosive allegation was one of racial bias within the palace. Meghan revealed that while she was pregnant with their son Archie, there had been conversations among unnamed family members about how dark his skin might be. This single claim transformed their personal struggle into a global scandal about the monarchy's soul. It painted the institution not just as cold, but as possessing a deep-seated, unacknowledged prejudice, a system that saw their child as a problem to be discussed rather than a baby to be celebrated. This was their ultimate argument, that the palace had deemed them and their mixed-race child too great a risk to the brand. The entire interview was a meticulously presented case that they were the targets of a quiet, relentless campaign to force their compliance or ensure their departure. The palace's response was a masterclass in the old ways of denial. There was no immediate, emotional rebuttal. Instead, the institution deployed its time-tested strategy of brief denials and formal procedure. A short, carefully worded statement was issued, expressing that the whole family was saddened to learn the full extent of the challenges Harry and Meghan had faced. The most telling line was the one that addressed the race allegation directly, stating that while some recollections may vary, the issue would be taken very seriously and addressed privately by the family. The phrase, "some recollections may vary," was a diplomatic atom bomb, a polite way of calling their testimony into question without a direct, messy confrontation. It was the ultimate institutional denial, refusing to engage with the specifics while projecting an image of sober concern. This was the velvet glove. The iron fist followed soon after. The palace announced a formal investigation into allegations that Meghan had bullied her staff during her time as a working royal. This was not a coincidence. It was a classic counter-coup maneuver. While the world was focused on the Sussexes' accusations of racism and neglect, the palace pivoted the narrative to one of Meghan as a difficult, demanding boss. The investigation was their weapon of choice, a bureaucratic process that allowed them to paint her as the aggressor, not the victim. It was damage control perfected over centuries, reframing the conversation from institutional failure to personal conduct. The public was presented with two conflicting stories, a modern royal soap opera. But behind the headlines, this was a brutal fight for control. The Sussexes used a global media platform to accuse the institution of a silent coup. The institution responded with the tools it knows best: polite public denial and a formal, private inquiry designed to dismantle their credibility. One side fought with emotional truth, the other with procedural power. In that clash, you can see the entire ancient history of the palace coup playing out on a 21st century screen, proving that the methods may change, but the ruthless game remains the same. The throne casts the longest shadow, and the person waiting in it is always a paradox. They are the designated successor, the living embodiment of the monarch's eventual mortality, and a potential rival power center all at once. This creates a permanent, simmering tension, a low-grade civil war simmering within the very architecture of the monarchy itself. For 7 decades, the relationship between Queen Elizabeth II and her son, Prince Charles, was the ultimate expression of this delicate dance. His entire adult life was spent in a state of suspended animation, preparing for a job that would only become his through the death of his mother. This was not a simple waiting game, it was an institutional schism. Over the decades, 2 distinct courts emerged, each with its own staff, its own priorities, and its own vision for the future. Buckingham Palace was the seat of the reigning sovereign, a bastion of tradition and established protocol. Just down the mall, Clarence House became the headquarters of the heir, a place buzzing with new ideas, ambitious charitable projects, and a team loyal not to the crown itself, but to the man who would one day wear it. The two households were often at odds, engaging in a quiet, bureaucratic Cold War. Charles' aides were seen as pushy and meddlesome by the Queen's more conservative private secretaries, who viewed the prince's forays into architecture and environmentalism with deep suspicion. They were two separate engines running in the same machine, and the friction between them was a constant, unspoken feature of royal life. As the Queen entered her later years, a subtle but profound power shift began. The public engagement slowed, the long-haul travel ceased, and more responsibilities were quietly delegated. Charles began to stand in for her at major events like the state opening of Parliament, reading the government's agenda from the throne she had occupied for so long. His face appeared on the postage stamps of Commonwealth nations. His opinions, once dismissed as the meddling of an impatient prince, began to carry the implicit weight of a king in waiting. The establishment, always pragmatic, started to pivot its gaze from the setting sun to the one preparing to rise. This was not a hostile takeover, but a glacial, inevitable transfer of influence. The court at Clarence House was no longer just a rival. It was a government in exile, slowly being absorbed into the main administration. Every time Charles represented the Queen, every time he signed a document on her behalf, he was not just helping his mother, he was rehearsing for his own reign. The shadow was gradually merging with the substance, proving that the most patient coup of all is the one that simply waits for time to do its work. The monarchy's survival now depends on managing crises before they can fully erupt. Under King Charles III, the institution is attempting a delicate balancing act, presenting a more streamlined and professional public face, while grappling with the same ancient threats from within. The core team has been deliberately narrowed to a trusted few: the King, Queen Camilla, and the Prince and Princess of Wales, a tight unit designed to project stability and unity. William and Catherine have become the embodiment of this new strategy, their every public appearance a masterclass in controlled accessibility. They are the modern face of an ancient institution, their polished demeanor and seemingly solid marriage acting as a bulwark against the chaos of the past. Their role is not merely to be popular, but to be predictable, to provide a narrative so consistent and reassuring that it leaves little room for scandal or surprise. This is a preemptive coup against unpredictability itself, an effort to firewall the core monarchy from the kind of personal turmoil that has historically crippled it. Yet this very streamlining creates its own vulnerabilities. With the working royal family so small, any misstep by a senior member carries far greater consequence. There is no longer a cast of supporting players to absorb public criticism or distract from a central drama. The entire weight of the institution rests on the shoulders of just a few individuals, making their perfection not an ideal, but a necessity for survival. Can a 1,000-year-old institution truly place all its bets on the flawless performance of one nuclear family? Meanwhile, the ghost at the feast remains the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Harry and Meghan represent a permanent, externalized crisis, a rival narrative operating just beyond the palace walls. They are no longer internal problems to be managed with quiet pressure or legalistic maneuvers. They are a competing media entity with a global platform. Every interview, every documentary, every public statement from California is a potential challenge to the official story emanating from London. The palace's traditional tool of denial is almost useless against them because they possess the means to instantly broadcast their own version of events to millions. This creates a perpetual state of low-grade conflict, a Cold War fought with podcasts and palace press releases. The institution can no longer silence its critics. It can only try to outmaneuver them in the global arena of public opinion, a battle for which its centuries of secluded tradition have left it profoundly unprepared. The relentless eye of social media has shattered the old rules of privacy and control. Courtiers can no longer rely on discreet phone calls to friendly newspaper editors to kill a story. A single tweet from a bystander, a viral TikTok video, or a leak from a disgruntled staffer can ignite a global firestorm in minutes, bypassing all the traditional gatekeepers. The public now demands not just pageantry, but authenticity, a quality that is fundamentally at odds with the monarchy's core operating principle of calculated presentation. The great unanswered question is whether the institution's ancient immune system, designed for quiet, internal takeovers, can adapt to fight a virus that is now everywhere at once. The future of the palace coup may not be a silent struggle behind gilded doors, but a loud, public, and utterly unwinnable war against transparency itself. The glittering crown has always been polished with secrets and lies. From the gilded cages of the 19th century to the modern media wars, the palace coup remains the monarchy's most vital and most consistently denied survival mechanism. This is not a flaw in the system, it is the system itself. Every instance we have witnessed, from King George IV's ruthless legal campaign against his own queen to the clinical, public exile of Prince Andrew, serves the same brutal corporate directive: protect the brand at all costs. The institution functions like a single ancient organism in any individual within it. A king, a queen, a princess, a duke is expendable if they threaten the health of the whole. These hidden power struggles are not aberrations. They are the essential, if ugly, process of adaptation. The monarchy survives precisely because it knows how to quietly shed its own skin, to remove a problematic ruler or neutralize a rebellious spirit before the public ever realizes the throne is wobbling. Yet this cold, political necessity comes with a profound human toll. We have seen the broken spirits, from Princess Margaret's confined life to the tragic, global spectacle of Diana's rebellion. We have witnessed the personal dreams sacrificed on the altar of duty, and the families torn apart by a loyalty that values the abstract crown over the living, breathing people who wear it. The beautiful facade of unity and tradition is just that, a facade, maintained by a millennia-old public relations machine that expertly rewrites forced removals as voluntary sacrifices and political executions as romantic gestures. The true history of royalty is written not in the official biographies, but in these silent, internal wars. It makes you wonder which of these denied coups strikes you as the most revealing. Was it the shocking humiliation of Queen Caroline, the perfectly executed abdication of Edward VIII, or the very modern, very public self-exile of Harry and Meghan? Share your thoughts in the comments. because every one of these stories peels back another layer of gold leaf to reveal the ruthless, unyielding machinery that has kept the crown in place for 1,000 years.